Va bene, allora oggi ci troviamo in conversazione con Peter Frase, che è un autore che ha pubblicato con Treccani Quattro modelli di futuro, questo è il titolo del libro, Quattro modelli di futuro e C'è vita, oltre il capitalismo, il sottotitolo. E un libro originariamente uscito negli Stati Uniti nel 2016 e poi tradotto per il pubblico italiano e pubblicato nel 2019, quindi presentato un anno fa e forse sarà proprio interessante riprendere i temi di quella presentazione a distanza di un anno in un mondo che probabilmente sente di essere cambiato o comunque di essersi dovuto adattare a una trasformazione che per quanto prevedibile non era definita nel tempo. Insomma, di fatto ci troviamo di fronte a una specie di crisi globale o comunque un'emergenza globale che qualcuno aveva immaginato come ipotesi di una società umana fortemente interconnessa, appunto una società in cui la trasmissione non solo di informazioni, ma anche di merci, ma anche i contatti tra le persone sono velocizzati, sono pressoché universalizzati. Ed ecco che quindi forse una crisi pandemica potevamo immaginarcela come uno degli scenari possibili. Questa intervista la condurremo da questo momento in poi in inglese. Aggiungo soltanto per chi non conoscesse l'autore che è un membro del comitato editoriale del magazine Jacobin, il titolo dice molto degli orientamenti, ed è anche membro dei Democratic Socialists of America. And so Peter, this is now over to you, and I wanted to ask you to begin with, you probably have said fairly explicitly you see yourself as a Marxist, although I don't know whether you might find that kind of label is particularly important. I mean, obviously, what counts foremost are the terms of an analysis and not the kind of label that might be put on them. But I wanted to say, I mean, often there's a question of, let's say, authenticity of the source, or, you know, the kind of whether the claims one makes for oneself in a way square with their background or their life situation. So I was going to ask you a question along the lines of, who are you and what is your background? Meaning, really, what you see yourself as standing for, and also what you would hope for yourself, given your, let's say, position in life, and given the kind of social model you might find to be a welcome opportunity and also possibility for the future. This is just, I mean, so to put it bluntly, this is just to prevent, I was still thinking of the, you know, the radical chic label placed on, you know, a bunch of American intellectuals who were canvassing for the Black Panthers. And, you know, the quip was obviously maybe quite obvious. You might have someone saying, but, you know, you're a hypocrite, you're son of a Harvard professor or something. And maybe this is an issue and maybe not. And this is really what I'm trying to get you to comment on.
Sure. So in terms of my own background, it is, I would say, you know, in the terms at least that we use in the United States, it's upper middle class. It's not a poor, you know, not from the poorest layers of the working class. Certainly my father is a university professor, and so that's how I grew up in Minneapolis, where I'm from. You know, and so I am, I guess, one of those people who's coming to socialism and to Marxism comes by way of recognizing my own origins in a relatively privileged layer, although certainly not the capitalist class as such. You know, I sometimes say there's a couple of different ways to tell the origin story of my politics and my theoretical approach. One of them is, is that I say I'm a Marxist of the HX section, meaning the HX section is in one of the systems we use for library categorization in the United States, is where they put all the socialist books. And I learned a lot of my politics going to the library as a nerdy child and reading those books. But the other explanation is that, unlike some other people of their social stratum, my parents sent me to the Minneapolis public schools, to big city public schools for my whole life. And at least in the United States, going to big city public schools is an immediate education in class, is my view. You immediately come to recognize, if you're paying attention, that you are in an environment where the people around you have wildly different chances in life, wildly different opportunities. The friends and classmates that you have these wildly different life chances for reasons that have nothing to do with them and everything to do with who their families are and what their parents do and where they live and so on. And so at that point, you're sort of forced to make a choice of either coming up with a story that justifies those inequalities, which makes you some variant of a pro-capitalist person, or you come to the conclusion that I came to, is that those things have no reason to exist, that we live in a society where they don't need to exist, that we live in a society wealthy enough that everybody can have a decent place to live and a right to healthcare and education and food, and to not have to work every day, every minute of their life. And the reason we don't have that is because of the power relations that exist within our society, rather than because of any natural order or any automatic reason that should be the case. And so I guess that would be the short version, I would say, of how I came to the politics I have now, of wanting an egalitarian socialist future that wealthy societies could provide if there was the political space open for that, rather than the inequalities that, in ever more stark ways in the current crisis are on display in the United States, in Italy, in many countries.
Okay, that's brilliant. And, very, very intelligible to me. And I've often sort of seen myself, I one time answered the question as to who I was or how I see myself. And I say, well, the thing is, I belong to an intellectual bourgeoisie, but not to an economic bourgeoisie, meaning that I'm in a position where I see the problems and in a way experience the problems, and would look not only for myself, but for everyone to a possible social model where, given the wealth we see as available, there is no real reason why there should be such inequality, considering the kind of problems it might lead to. I mean, one thing we might say is that the open society, as we know it, is in a way its own enemy, and has certainly produced an order of problems which aren't really taken into consideration in the theoretical model, but we see in our everyday experience. And moving towards the book, there's one thing that's striking about it is that it has a marked tendency to simplify the issues. Simplify the issues not in the terms of producing a sort of simplistic analysis or a simplistic proposed solution, but a drive towards clarity, where you go through all of the literature, you look at all of the positions, but ultimately it comes to a set of two fundamental principles whereby you end up with only 4 possible boxes, and the 4 possible boxes are the 4 possible outcomes which you see. So you have along the axis of hierarchy versus equality, and along the axis of abundance versus scarcity. At that junction, you produce exactly 4 possible outcomes where these 2 variables come to interact with each other. So in a way, there's something very Aristotelian about it. There's something about clarifying to the extent that there is a principle of, let's say, an excluded middle. The middle might be a model, and the model is not what we want. We want a clear scenario for the future. But you've probably talked about the book a lot, and this leads to me asking, you must have answered a lot of questions, and you must have answered a lot of questions that in a way are similar. And so my question to you now is, what are the questions you are tired of being asked? Not because they get asked too often, because obviously a question that is often asked might be a fairly perfectly legitimate question and one that is worth asking, but because they seem to be misguided, because they seem to be the wrong questions, leading to basically nowhere, when other more urgent questions might actually be the right ones to be addressing.
Sure. So I guess the number one on that list for me has to be, well, which of these futures do you think now is more likely? Or, which one are we headed towards? Or how has your view of that changed since you started the project? Those sorts of things. Because I think, as you sort of put it, they fundamentally misconstrue what it is that I am trying to do. That I'm not trying to engage in a work of futurism or prediction, even though I understand how it can seem that way, particularly because that's a more familiar model for people in terms of the kind of bourgeois writing to which I'm adjacent. And I recognize that in part of what I'm doing, is doing something that tries to move out of the realm of Marxist treatises or academic theoretical leftism and be in conversation with sort of a different audience. But it does lead to this misconstrual, I think, which is kind of twofold. One, it's not meant to be a work of prediction because it's meant to create, as you said, some clarifications, some simple principles to guide thought and action. And so to treat it as a work of prediction is immediately to adopt a passive kind of stance toward the work. Whereas as a work of kind of popular Marxism, I think of it as a way of helping to interpret and to change the world rather than sort of a document that simply gives a prediction that can be true or false. And secondarily, there's the issue that the point of calling it four futures and creating these four simplified scenarios was, as I say in the book with the line from William Gibson, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. The point was to clarify and emphasize elements of the society we currently live in, as much as to say what that society might be in the future. And finally, to treat it as a work of prediction is counter to actually one of my core theoretical commitments, which is that people make their own history, but not under the conditions of their own choosing. That is, that there's something theoretically false about any individual theorist trying to predict the future, because that future necessarily, particularly if you're thinking of it in emancipatory terms, as possibly in a more egalitarian, more democratic future, has to be actually the work of the masses of people who create that future and can't be laid out in advance by me or by anybody else. So I guess to me, that's what I would call the kind of cluster of questions that, while I understand what causes them and where they arise and how they in some ways flow from the choices that I made and how I presented the book, do also get a bit frustrating to respond to sometimes.
Okay. All right, and listen, another thing that occurred to me is that we met probably almost exactly a year ago. So that was around the time, around now was the time of your presentation last year in Italy. The book obviously has a longer history and will have been, actually, how long did it take you to research and prepare the book? I mean, what was it? Can you give us something about its own history?
Yeah, so that's a bit complex. The actual book itself, was produced fairly quickly, but that's because in some ways it's a summation of things I had been thinking about or working on for 10 years prior to that. It's interesting, you talk about the sort of the simplicity of the fourfold typology that it lays out of, equality and hierarchy and scarcity and abundance. In fact, the original version of this only had two poles. The very first iteration of this sort of thought experiment that eventually became the book I produced probably about 10 years ago now as just a blog post. And it was really just predicated on me thinking around some ideas about science fiction and particularly about the show Star Trek. And, the stuff that it ends up in the book about Star Trek being essentially a communist post-scarcity society, and then thinking through how you could have sort of a hierarchical class-based society based on those same technological presuppositions. That was the beginning. I wrote a little post called Anti-Star Trek, which sort of laid out what this sort of mirror version of Star Trek, this pseudo-capitalist version of Star Trek might look like. And I wrote that up, and then that got this was back when blogs were much more of a big thing, and it got circulated in some more well-known places. This was a little before Jacobin even started, so this was kind of pre all that. And then it sort of ramified from there when an old friend and socialist comrade of mine saw it and sent me an email and said, this is very interesting, but I think there's the dimension of ecological crisis and climate change being left out here. How does that factor into it? And I was like, well, you're right. I guess I need to add this extra dimension to it. And so then the fourfold topology just kind of falls out of that. And, I was trained as a sociologist, and sociologists love their 2x2 grid diagrams. And so it just seemed like a natural way to proceed. And so then that, then in the early days of Jacobin, it happened to be that the essay version of Four Futures, which basically set out the template for the book, was published in, I believe it's the 5th issue of Jacobin, which happened to coincide with the Occupy Wall Street encampment and the explosion of that in the United States in late 2011. And so that was the kind of first issue where Jacobin started to really take off. And that happened to have Four Futures in it, which, because of the way Jacobin worked back then, I just sent an email to Bhaskar, the publisher and founder of Jacobin, because I'd had stuff in all of the issues up to that point. I said, hey, Bhaskar, I've got this kind of kooky idea for something I want to write for the new issue. And he's like, sure, do it, whatever. And Four Futures was the title he gave it. And then, so that was sort of what started, that was all sort of what started it off on its course.
Okay. I was curious about, the psychologies of the individuals at play is obviously a determining factor in the attitude they will have to making their own future and also possibly imagining their own future. A quote that struck me from possibly an interview is that having power over people is for many powerful people its own reward. Okay, so that obviously is the kind of psychological attitude which is going to prevent them from any sort of long-term perspective where you might actually have something which is a necessary reward for not only themselves but also everyone else. Our general incapacity to imagine the future or approach it in any realist terms. What comes to mind is, I don't know, the starkness with which Keynes might have said, in the long run, we're all dead. And it takes something to come out with something like that, because imagining the future takes us to a point where, we might no longer be part of the picture, for instance, or the picture might be too bleak. So there is this about failing to imagine the future. And now I'm not going to in any way justify the position, but it sort of throws back a sort of curious justification, at least, on the idea that, what was I going to say? In a way, we're sort of living within the sort of perpetual end of history. We would like it to be that history has come to an end, and what we have is basically, fundamentally what there is. And this is what brings me to our interview, our presentation a year ago. A year ago, the day we are talking today would have been the future, would have been a year ahead. And a year ago, we would not have been able to foresee this was going to happen. And when I say this was going to happen, I mean a global pandemic with all of the incredible chain of events and consequences that it brings in train. Now, so there is this issue about the future, to an extent, always being unforeseen. And from your standpoint, or our standpoint of our position a year ago, what does this, let's say, future to be that was then look like? So if you take yourself back to last year and you sort of picture this present scenario, how would it have appeared to you in terms of our categories, in terms of our sort of 2x2 grid lines? What do you see as actually taking place in terms of what would have been one of the possible futures that are facing us?
Well, if I can sort of think about how to answer this question, and maybe if it's maybe what you're asking. I can sort of refract where we are now through the framework of the book. Even though obviously there's certain elements of the scenario now which are different. And in the book, this at the center of it, one of the themes is this question of automation and the replacement of human labor by machines and the implications of that for human societies, which at the moment appears to have receded into the background, although I think it is a background condition of what now appears to be very much questions of labor being put front and center in ways that were not obvious before for a lot of people. Which is to say that on the one hand, you have this recognition of certain types of what we in this U.S. now come to call essential workers, that, the people whose jobs remain, people who continue having to go to work and risk their health, the medical workers, the grocery store workers, the cleaners, and so on. At the same time, as offices are emptied out and people try to work from home or are not working at all, we see the question raised of what work is inessential from a standpoint of the reproduction of society, even if it may be necessary in a different way as a form of social control, in the sense that, insofar as we are all defined both in terms of our economic sustenance and in terms of our identities by our attachment to wage labor, there's a very strong push, and there's very good reasons why the powerful want to maintain that attachment. And that a pandemic like this, when all kinds of things are sort of thrown into chaos, threatens to reveal the unnecessary work that exists only as that form of social control. And then, of course, finally, you have the other kind of essential work, the unpaid work, the household work, the care work, the things that now are all kind of running together, especially for those in the working from home situation, and also with schools being closed, and so people having to manage children. And so the role of the state and the education system, not only in directly educating, but also in creating the childcare infrastructure that allows so much other work to go on. I think that's all, those are all sort of themes of those different, the differentiating between those different types of work is something I've written and talked a lot about, of the sort of the socially necessary versus the unnecessary versus the unpaid, but yet necessary kinds of work, and that's all been revealed in a sort of very stark way. And I think we're going to see continually as we both attempt to come out of the pandemic and also recover from the recession or depression that we're now in. Then I think that those are going to be the questions on the table. At the same time, these other themes that are in the book of ecology and of class struggle play themselves out in their specific ways. In our present moment. So you have these sort of moments of these little moments of post-scarcity communism that pop up, whether like the story that popped up in Italy of people using their 3D printers to make ventilator equipment, which is then mirrored on the other side by the companies that own that intellectual property trying to stop them from doing so. And also the possibility that any vaccine that comes up for this disease will become the subject of an intellectual property war, potentially between the U.S. and China, for example. What we now in the United States is sort of the shorthand is used the Green New Deal for an ecological sort of social democracy package of investment in green energy infrastructure and jobs and so on. Now that we are in this new kind of depression environment, that as a response to the economic crisis is obviously on the agenda, and also the stakes of the climate crisis are revealed in an interesting way. There have been a number of articles that have come out talking about what's happened to carbon emissions in the context of these widespread economic shutdowns. And what it's shown is that it hasn't actually pressed carbon emissions that much, or at least enough to make the difference that we need to make, which shows that any kind of approach to this based just on individual decisions and behavior is not going to work, because we're doing about as much of that as we conceivably could, and it's not doing what's necessary. And so there's that. And so then that poses this question of, are we going to get some kind of Green New Deal, global ecological social democracy, or, the kind of thing that I talk about in the book of the rich kind of finding their own enclaves where they can get away from the effects of climate change while the rest of us are forced to suffer. And in that vein, you can really look at COVID-19 as an aspect of the ecological crisis as much as anything. It's the structures of interconnected global capitalism and its conditions of production and reproduction that led pandemics like this to arise. Mike Davis has been writing about this for years from a Marxist perspective. And you see the stories about the rich trying to flee off to their, bunkers in New Zealand or whatever to get away from the pandemic in the immediate sense, but that was always sort of part of the agenda in terms of people trying to flee the effects of the climate crisis. So I think you can view what's happening now very much through the lens of what I was talking about in the book. And finally, I'll just say one little bit about the automation piece, which, as I said, appears to sort of have receded into the background as, instead of talking about automating everything, we're talking about forcing people to, go back to work in grocery stores so that, people can get food even if people are getting sick. But I think that is sort of a longer term issue here where, certainly what we're confronting in the United States is that on the one hand, we're deeming these workers essential, whether they're grocery workers or they're immigrant agricultural workers or meatpacking plant workers, but yet what we're not doing is paying them a wage and providing them with the benefits that would be commensurate with, I think a more just valuation of that labor. And ultimately, the question I think that's going to be posed, particularly as we start to see more labor unrest around these issues by these essential workers, is one of these dynamics that I talked about in the book, is that ultimately the question comes down to, for a lot of capitalists, the question comes down to, well, ultimately what's cheaper and easier for me, the worker or the machine? And for workers like, a lot of American workers now, when they are beaten down and underpaid and disorganized, then they can be cheaper than the machine. But at some point, the horizon of organizing for the rights that I think all workers deserve does lead in the direction of, maybe this is the thing, to take one tiny small example. It's been said for years, people really resist in the grocery store using the automatic checkout machine. People don't like it. People would just rather have a human cashier, and also people sort of see it as sort of a gesture of solidarity to not support people losing their jobs to these machines. But of course, in an environment of pandemic, when both the worker and the customer is potentially subjecting themselves to death, then people may start to think, well, it's perhaps a small price to pay to use the automated machines. And I think we may start to see little things like that as we reconfigure for this pandemic and others that will probably come. We will see the little ways in which our societies are reconfigured, perhaps in certain ways to use less human labor. This may be the push in that direction.
And one thing that strikes me, if I sort of take myself back a year, is that, obviously globalization was something we were all talking about and seemed inevitable as a trend which had needed to be interpreted, whether for good or for bad, or whether in a sort of positive or negative light. Another might have been the role of the state versus private enterprise. And it is curious that, sort of 1 year from there, globalization has sort of marched headlong in the direction of a global pandemic. But on the other hand, if we look at the claims that the state might be dead as an employer or as a sort of an engine for industry, we're having sort of the sort of renationalization, or at least the sort of in-house production. This is happening in Italy. Italy went through a spell of having no face masks for protection because they were all imported, and there were serious problems with the sort of global chain of transmission. So simply it was getting to a point where the face masks were there, except they would be introduced outside. There was no way of getting them into the country until the country primed itself to producing its own. So the return of certain sectors of industry back in-house, and possibly with a more or less strong measure of state support, whether the state is actually a sort of a partner in the business or whether the state is simply funding the business through buying stocks and redistributing. And fixing prices. I mean, face masks have been produced at a standard cost and are being sold at a standard price, which would have been unthinkable a year ago. That would have sounded to any economist as sort of the sort of worst nightmare imaginable. And now it is not only necessary but also beneficial, which is ironic in a way. So coming from a year ago. So I was just wondering whether you have a comment on that, and whether you have a final comment on any of the false dichotomies we might do away with, as for example, sort of open and closed societies. Are open societies doing better than closed societies? I mean, is China faring any better or worse than the United States, or than Russia, or than any European country? Anything that comes to mind in sort of clearing away sort of thought categories we really don't need to be dealing with, because they don't take us anywhere near to understanding the picture and what kind of options we have.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I tend to think that the sort of terminology of, say, open and closed societies is not that helpful, because it's never clear to me, or there's like a lot of ideological baggage attached to being exactly what is open and what is closed. And to what are we just talking about the role of the state? And there, I think certainly in the American context is one of the great mythologies is that we somehow live in a country in which the state is not involved in every aspect of the economy, though of course we are, whether it's by setting the ground rules or the laws, or by favoring certain segments over others. I mean, we are, in the position now of, from an American perspective right now, Italy looks like a remarkably efficient and well-run country, because our country is, of course, being controlled at the top by just basically a gang of criminal looters. But even below that level, it's even the somewhat more competent managers are still committed to the sort of plutocratic approach that, prevailed before this. And so at a federal level, of course, yes, you have things like the president, the Trump administration having masks and other supplies seized from the governors of states so that they can be redistributed to private entities to be sold. So, I mean, it's just straight up, criminal looting and profiteering. But at the state level, so, the governor of my state, New York, is a Democratic Party politician and is somewhat more competent, but he has been also very committed to using this crisis to continue to push through cuts to social services, cuts even to medical spending, as well as education spending in the midst of this crisis, because he's unwilling to even consider the step of, taxing the billionaire class that supports him even a little bit to address the crisis. And I think what we're seeing here, the distinction you can see internationally is not so much open or closed or sort of authoritarian or democratic. I mean, China and South Korea are very different kinds of societies, both of which seem to have, or Vietnam, for example, all of which have had much, much better responses than the US or Italy or the United Kingdom or, Russia, it seems. Or Brazil, it cuts across, I think, our conventional count of what counts democratic or authoritarian society, at least. I think at least in the United States, because again, the ideology of neoliberalism and of kind of anti-state capitalism is so embedded here. There is, I think, among the ruling class, it's right-wing, but also a lot of it's left-wing, what I think of as really even a kind of a magical thinking. It's not merely that they want to try to, as they say, reopen the economy, quote unquote, so that we can all go back to work and die for capital accumulation. That is what they want. But I think they're in some ways deluding even themselves as to how possible that is. As though if you just say, okay, open the restaurants, open the beaches, open the movie theaters, then suddenly economic growth will take off again. And maybe there'll be thousands of deaths, but that's the price we pay. But I don't even think, even if that trade-off, it's immoral, but even aside from that, I don't think it's possible. I don't think without a massive state-directed project of both directly supporting people's income through something like a guarantee-based income for everyone, plus massive investment in, hopefully things like green energy and other things that actually are productive for the future of our Without that, I mean, we are just in a depression without much of an end in sight, I think. And I think the prospect of that is frightening and so profoundly at odds with the mainstream of, you know, of political and economic thought that has prevailed for my whole lifetime, that I think even the most sort of astute and farsighted of our ruling ideologists and politicians are having a hard time accepting it. And so I think that's part of what makes this such a confusing, but in some ways sort of exciting time, because we are really in uncharted territory. You know, there's a line from Vladimir Lenin that very quickly went from being sort of a niche interest of leftists to a cliche, which is sort of in the spirit of the quote itself, which is that there are, you know, years when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. And we've been going through one week like that after another, it seems, for the past couple of months, which is, you know, for someone like me who's interested in thinking about radical social transformation and change, it's frightening, but it's also fascinating.
Okay, well, Peter, listen, I mean, you know, it looks like the future is open, although we don't know open to exactly what options, and that is, to an extent, as you say, up to us. But the time for this interview is actually up, and it was great talking to you. Thanks for answering in such detail. And anything coming up? Any new publication you're working on?
Nothing that's immediately.
We might see you for a new presentation in Italy.
Yeah, I mean, nothing that's sort of imminent, but I am sort of working through, not quite, you know, it won't end up the same, of course, but sort of using I was thinking through some of the same thematics, and particularly some of these questions of the nature of work and of social reproduction in the context of this pandemic. And, you know, again, because everything right now feels so unsettled and uncertain, it's hard to commit any thoughts to a document just yet. But I am collecting, and, you know, I've had a couple of things published at Jacobin, and, you know, more recently, that have tried to work through some of this stuff. So I would just say, you know, people can keep an eye on my, you know, my website, my Twitter, and so on, and sort of where I try to be, you know, be out there trying to reckon with all this stuff.
Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you very, very soon.
Yes, guys, stay well, stay healthy, and hopefully I will be able to come back to Italy one day soon.
Okay, and let's not stay home too long. Yeah. All right then. Goodbye.
Hey, thanks.